The story I'm about to share is probably one of the weirdest things that has ever happened to me. It wasn't objectively scary at the moment, but the more I reflect on that night, the more I'm realizing just how disturbing and horrifying it really was. For my job, I had to travel a lot. My company used to pay for me to stay in a hotel, but lately, they've paid for me to reserve an Airbnb, which is great if I'm being honest. Instead of staying in hotels all over the country, which, let's face it, is mostly the same, I get to experience unique and fascinating places. I've stayed in skyline apartments, I've stayed in suburban homes, and I've even stayed in a completely renovated garage with a hot tub and a sweet gaming setup. As great as all of that is though, I have stayed in some horrible places. One time, the cops were called to the house next door where I was staying, and it got ugly. Fights started, and let's just say a whole bunch of cops were called. That could be its own horrifying story, but the one I'm about to share is much darker. I can't remember the exact name of the town, but it was somewhere in upstate New York. I tried to find the listing for the sake of this story, but I was unsuccessful. The lister must have taken the rental off of AIRBNB's website. I was coming off of a streak of fancy apartments, and I wanted to stay somewhere that was quiet and more remote. I found this cute little place that was nestled in the woods. It wasn't a cabin or anything like that, and it wasn't insanely secluded. It was just private enough that it was perfect for me. The neighbors were probably 40 or 50 feet away, but there was so many trees in between that it felt like you were truly in the middle of the woods, even though you weren't. The house was beautiful. The inside was set up with that wilderness aesthetic, and it just felt real cozy. I'm sure this makes me sound creepy, but one thing I love to do when I get to a new place is I love to explore the house a little bit. You get to have a brief glimpse of the person who lives there, and I like to generate an idea in my head of who this person was. Well, in this house I went into the basement, and it was just disturbing on its own. It was one of those dark and creepy basements. It kind of looked like the basement from Amityville Horror. As I was snooping around the basement, I found this panel on the wall that looked off for some reason. It just looked different, and it was a different color, and it was slightly crooked. I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I ended up banging on the wall, and it felt hollow. I banged on another wall, and it wasn't hollow and hurt my hand. Without thinking, I tried to move the strange wall, and to my surprise, it sort of just came off easily into my hands. Behind the wall was the first disturbing sight in this nightmare. It was a dark room that looked more like you'd see in a dungeon. There was a light switch that illuminated the dim room. In the middle of the room was a bed with a worn out and disgusting looking blanket. I instantly felt off about this. The room was cold, like way colder than the rest of the basement. I tiptoed around the room trying not to touch anything and trying to figure out what the deal was with this disturbing room. Then, to make matters even worse, I noticed another strange panel on the wall in the room. This panel was much smaller than the last, but when I kicked it, it was hollow, just like the last panel. I tried moving it, and again, to my horror, it moved very easily. This panel was on the bottom of the wall next to the ground, so when I removed the panel, it just looked like a hole in the wall. But when I got down there with my flashlight, I noticed that the hole was a crawl space. I only crawled inside about 2 feet, but when I shined the flashlight into the darkness, I saw nothing but the dark void of blackness. This tunnel seemed to go on forever, and at this point, I didn't want to see where it led. I crawled out, and as I was standing in the scary bedroom, the doorbell rang. I froze. Why the heck was the doorbell ringing? It was after 9 p.m. at this point, and there would be no reason for me to have a visitor. I snuck upstairs and looked out the front window, and I saw a tall figure with a hood. They were just standing there, and they would ring the doorbell every few seconds. I kid you not, they waited over 10 minutes, and then slowly, they walked away. As soon as I didn't see him, I grabbed my bag and ran to my car. I decided to stay in a hotel for the rest of my stay in this town. I remember as I was driving away, I saw the hooded figure run from the driveway, but once I was clearly on the road, he stopped chasing me. I remember calling a buddy after this, and I happened to downplay all of this. I just figured the guy running at my car and ringing the doorbell was a neighbor looking for the owner, and I thought there would have been a reasonable explanation for the creepy room in the basement. But the more time that passes, the more I think back to that night, and I realize just how terrifying that night was. I was only supposed to stay that night, and I never reached back out to the owner after my stay. What do you think that room was? And where do you think that crawl space led to? And was that creepy guy somehow involved? Or am I really just overthinking all of this? It was supposed to be a special getaway for my wife and me. We decided to spend a weekend at a cozy AIRBNB in the countryside, hoping for some peace and relaxation. Little did we know that our escape would turn into a nightmarish ordeal we would never forget. As we arrived at the house, we noticed something strange. The walls were adorned with an assortment of masks. Masks from horror movies, ancient cultures, and all kinds of grotesque designs stared back at us. I remember my wife saying something about masks, but I didn't think it was going to be throughout the entire house. She was a big horror buff, so she didn't care nearly as much as I did. It was eerie, to say the least, but we brushed it off as a quirky taste by the owner. Despite the unsettling decor, we settled into the house, and I hoped the masks wouldn't bother me too much. The evening passed uneventfully, and we retired to the bedroom, looking forward to a restful night. But our dreams of tranquility were about to be shattered. In the middle of the night, a sudden knock echoed through the house, jolting us awake. The sound seemed to reverberate through the walls, leaving us paralyzed. My heart raced, and I nudged my wife, who was now wide awake. Her eyes were filled with alarm. We looked at each other, and I could see the worry written on her face. We were unsure of what to do. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent, and then it just stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage, I mustered the strength to rise from the bed, and I tiptoed toward the bedroom door. When I reached the hall, I felt like collapsing. Standing at the end of the hall was a strange-looking figure with a horrifying mask. It was a white mask with these strange blacked-out eyes. I yelled something at the figure, and they said nothing. They just took a short step forward. The masked figure was slightly hunched over, and I could hear them breathing heavily underneath the mask. Then the masked man spoke, and in a soft and haunting voice the man said, "The mask brought me here." I was paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend the sinister meaning behind his words. I rushed back to my wife, gripping her arm as tightly as I can. As I hurriedly tried to explain the terrifying encounter, panic consumed us, and at the moment, survival became our only instinct, even if I wasn't in that much danger. Without wasting another second, we grabbed our belongings and dashed out into the moonlit night, right out the back door, leaving behind the eerie house and the masked owner. At least I think it was the owner. When we contacted him, he denied it intensely and claimed that we were making the entire incident up. That was the last time my wife and I ever went anywhere, and I have no desire to ever stay at an Airbnb ever again. Whether it was the owner playing a sick prank, or even worse, a stranger off the street, it was still the single most horrifying moment of my life, and I'm thankful every day to be alive. After ending a long-term relationship, I felt the need for a change of scenery, a night to forget about the sadness that consumed me. So, I decided to book an Airbnb, a luxury apartment in the heart of the city. This place overlooked the bustling streets below, and the listing boasted about the owner being a film producer. It seemed like a cool and glamorous choice for a brief escape. The pictures were incredible. As I entered the apartment, I couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. The place was adorned with film posters and memorabilia, giving it an intoxicating atmosphere. I almost felt guilty for wanting to go out and get some drinks instead of enjoying this unique apartment. But, as I said, I wanted to hit the town for some drinks in an effort to drown some of my sadness. The night was a blur of laughter and music, and for a brief moment, I managed to forget about my recent heartbreak. However, as the night grew darker, a lingering sense of unease settled within me. I'm not really into signs and emotions and things like that, but for whatever reason, at this moment, I felt like something was really off. I decided to call it a night and head back to the apartment. I stumbled back to the apartment, determined to find peace of mind before I went to bed. As I entered, I froze in my tracks. The owner, the so-called film producer, was inside of the apartment, setting up camera equipment. Confusion mixed with fear as I confronted him about his presence. Instead of looking like a deer in the headlights, he looked calm and relaxed, like it wasn't weird at all that he was in the apartment after midnight, setting up cameras for some reason. He casually downplayed the entire situation, shrugging it off as a routine occurrence. I demanded an explanation. My voice was trembling with a mixture of anger and apprehension, but his response was far from reassuring. A chilling smile crept across his face as he revealed a disturbing obsession with capturing the authentic experiences of his guests. His eyes looked like a kid on Christmas as he excitedly explained his work, claiming that this was art in its purest form. Even though I told him it was a crime and a major invasion of privacy, he just laughed. The blood drained from my face as I realized the perilous situation I had unknowingly stumbled into. Panic surged through me. I moved towards the door in desperation. I didn't want to stay any longer and find out if this man was dangerous, on top of being a creep. But as I continued to slowly move towards the door, the owner's demeanor changed in an instant. Anger twisted his features, and he lunged toward me, blocking my path. He started to scream incoherently, and I was actually so terrified at that moment that I forgot about the cameras, and I was so worried that this man was going to knock me out. Thankfully, I made it out, my pounding heart and gasping breaths a testament to my legitimate fear. I reported the incident to the police, hoping that they would bring an end to his twisted games. But even with the authorities involved, a lingering fear remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and that his depraved eyes followed my every move, lurking in the shadows. Even though I never saw him again, his actions that night plagued me longer than I care to admit. Time passed, and life slowly regained a semblance of normalcy. Yet, the memory of his horrifying encounter continued to haunt me, forever scarred in my mind. I realized then that even the most glamorous facades could conceal unimaginable darkness, and that sometimes the true horrors of this world are found not in the supernatural, but in the twisted depths of human nature.